Okay. Uh, okay. Uh, no, that's right. I gotta get myself out of the Discord. Because no one's on to talk. And if they are, they're playing different games. Okay, what am I going to watch? Hmm. Well, I guess it'd be more correct to say, what am I going to listen to? I guess I could always do a copy pasta. Mm, oh, okay. Okay. I guess I just won't listen to anything. Alright. Can you guys hear the game? Barely. Okay. That's fine. Whatever. I think I just heard. I think I just heard a. Oh wait, no, it was my bat coming into existence. Good night. Okay. Oh, he's down there. Okay. Alrighty. Huh. The fact that there are so many of them just from like a group of 5. Alright, Ancient Pyre. Okay, that was all I do. Kill the butcher, kill Hans. I wonder what Franz is. Did I just feel more bone in this? I saw that. Ooh, it's 13 more damage. No, I'm just going to keep with what I have right now. Well, what does it give me? I'm at 44, 59, 6. Okay, fuck it, whatever. Fierce craft. Not better than what I have.
It was Lazarus. Of that I am certain. He alone had the king's ear and whispered dark and evil magics into it, instilling the notion of an imminent attack on Westmarch. Afraid to speak against the Archbishop, the councillors nodded their empty heads in agreement and sent us off to die.
Do you want more?
Alright. Up to here. Why do they all now have damage reflect? Okay.
I feel more powerful.
I hear something stirring in the distance.
Well, that does not sound good. Oh, if it was only these. I heard you. Oh no, I know what I want to listen to now. Let's listen to World War One documentary. In numbers. Four and a half hours long.
This
I
channel
am
is
here
part
for
of
it.
the History Hits Network.
I tell you what, this makes it go go so much faster.
And a new kind of war. A war of numbers. Ammunition, guns, ships, aircraft, men who will die in their millions. A war fought by calculating generals for whom no cost is too high. The First World War is fought on a scale never before seen in the whole of human history. 1 billion artillery shells, 1 million machine guns, 50 billion bullets. 65 million men at war, who die at a rate of 6,000 a day. Men are reduced to numbers. Of all the men in Europe aged from 19 to 22 at the start of the war, a third will be dead by the end. No family will be left unscathed. The First World War changes the course of human history. Out of it comes communism and fascism. Out of it comes votes for every citizen, the foundation of modern democracy. It is a war between empires that destroys empires. It is a war in which the old rulers pay scant regard for the lives of ordinary people. And for this callous indifference, the old ruling class will pay the price. But how and why did it happen? August 1914. Across Europe, men have been called up to fight. The numbers already unprecedented in military history. It comes to a staggering 18 million.
No one really saw this coming. Europe had been at peace for over 40 years.
In the decade since the last European war, the continent has changed. Industrialization has introduced mass production. The machine age is changing society. And now it is about to transform the nature of human conflict.
It had never seen industrialized warfare on this scale.
Most previous European wars had been small affairs by comparison. But in the 19th century, industrial progress brings greater wealth and health. The population expands rapidly, especially in Germany, where it grows at a rate of almost 1 million a year, to over 67 million. The masses are seen by Europe's ruling classes as subjects, there to be governed, and when required, to fight. To understand the origins of the First World War, we must examine Europe's old ruling class and the empires which they aspired to build and govern. In 1914, the British possessed the largest empire the world has ever seen. It covers 12.7 million square miles. Britain governs a quarter of the world's population. Second in size is the Russian Empire of Tsar Nicholas II. Third largest and Britain's rival in Africa is France. Germany's tiny empire is just a tenth the size of Britain's.
Today, the whole idea of empire seems very anachronistic and very old-fashioned. But of
Shoulders.
course, back then it was incredibly important, especially for the ruling classes. Why? Because it gives them the ability to control a market in a way that you simply can't control a market today.
The British Empire is unusual. Britain has a large and influential merchant class, which has pioneered the idea of open, free trade. British exports are worth over £500 million. A quarter of all manufactured goods come from Britain. But most rulers see their empires as instruments of trade restriction and control. A bigger empire means more prestige and greater wealth at the expense of their rivals. For Germany, the small size of their empire is not just a matter of bruised pride. It is an obstacle to economic expansion. In the decades before 1914, Germany was going through her own industrial revolution, in some areas even overtaking Britain.
German industry and the German economy had been going through a boom period since the turn of the century. Electrical goods and chemical goods were the two leading sectors. In fact, only 3 German chemical companies dominated 90% of the world market by 1914.
German steel production increases 1,000% to almost 19 million tons, more than Britain, France and Russia combined.
Damn.
German companies are the world's main source of industrial chemicals, pharmaceuticals and dyes.
Even the khaki dye for the British uniforms came from Germany.
By the start of 1914, German industry is big, dynamic, but frustrated. It craves even greater access to world markets, to buy raw materials and to sell its finished products. Yet large areas of the world are under the control of foreign powers.
The German ruling elite were extraordinarily concerned that if they didn't catch up with the likes of Britain, France, the United States, and indeed even Russia, they would be left behind, they'd be deprived of the world's resources, gradually strangled.
The German elites were convinced that they had legitimate right, given the economic power that Germany had at the time, that this should also translate into a presence on the international stage.
But it's not just about cornering markets. Germany is still dominated by a noble officer caste, full-time soldiers who yearn both for the thrill and adventure of war, as well as the well-paid, prestigious colonial jobs that come with running a large empire. To build that empire, the Germans know they'll need a powerful navy. The job of building it falls to Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz.
Tirpitz realised that if you could create a large navy, it would allow you to project power and suck in commerce from around the world, expel investments, bring in raw materials, and ensure Germany's future.
German naval spending triples, from £8 million a year to £23 million. But Britain responds to Germany's naval ambitions by building even more ships. It decides to double the size of the Royal Navy, devoting to it no less than a quarter of all public spending, over £45 million. Britain has more ships and bigger ships. In 1906, she launches the most powerful battleship the world has ever seen, HMS Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is in a league of its own. Each of her 10 12-inch guns fires a half-ton shell. A single broadside can sink any opponent. By 1914, Britain has 22 giant dreadnoughts in service, 13 more under construction, and 574 other ships and submarines. 609 warships in total.
The strongest navy in the world today is the United States Navy, which has roughly 450 ships. So that gives you a sense of just how dominant the Royal Navy was in 1914.
It is and will remain one of the biggest navies in history. Germany can only muster 15 big battleships and 319 other vessels. All other navies in the world lag far behind. Germany's expanding navy, large standing army, and aggressive foreign policy fails to grow her empire. But it succeeds in worrying her imperial rivals: Britain, France, and Russia.
The German Weltpolitik, or world policy as it's called, had very little success. By 1913, not only have they got domestic problems which are causing the ruling elite some kind of anxiety, but on the international stage they have effectively managed to alienate Britain. They've certainly alienated France, an old rival and adversary, and they've pushed together France and Russia, two countries with entirely different political systems, but united only by a common concern about Germany.
It had been a complete shambles because it turned out that German military might did not translate into actual gain, and that all it produced, the pursuit of world politics, was increasing frictions and tensions in the international system.
Before the outbreak of war, continental Europe is fraught with tension. Its great imperial powers are jostling for position against one another, while attempting to suppress the aspirations and rebelliousness of their own subjects. Many members of Europe's aristocratic officer class are spoiling for a war. Unfortunately for them, and everyone else in Europe, they are about to get one. By the summer of 1914, Germany is surrounded by enemies. Her only friends among the imperial powers lie to the south. Germany has formed an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which for the last 60 years has been ruled by the Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph. The empire includes within its borders more than a dozen different nationalities. The most privileged are the Austrians, who rule over the Czechs and Poles in the western half of the empire, and the Hungarians, who rule over a hodgepodge of nationalities in the eastern half. To the south is the recently annexed province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, home to over 800,000 Serbs. This multi-ethnic mix is reflected in the empire's armies.
The makeup of the Austro-Hungarian army is quite remarkable. You have Slovaks, Austrians, Hungarians, even Slavs who would probably rather be fighting for the Russians, so it's a really unwieldy machine.
125.
To call up soldiers to the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army, posters have to be put up in 15 languages. Many of these disparate ethnic groups aspire to freedom and independence. Serb nationalists in Bosnia-Herzegovina receive encouragement and weapons from neighboring Serbia.
The aggressive nationalism of the Serbs threatened to undermine the whole stability of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy.
To the rest of Europe, it's a sideshow. The arrogant Habsburgs are having some local trouble controlling their messy empire. But the events that follow will lead to a devastating imperial war, and it starts with just 2 pistol shots. On the 28th of June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is shot dead whilst visiting the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo. It makes headlines across the world. The assassin belongs to a group backed by neighboring Serbia. As the Archduke is laid to rest, shock is turning to anger. And that anger is directed at Serbia. The Habsburg Emperor Franz Joseph wants to take action, but he knows that Serbia is friendly with Russia. Before he attacks, he wants a guarantee of German support against the big bear on his doorstep. On the 6th of July, he gets it. A telegram from Wilhelm II promises to back Austria whatever they decide. Germany has given Austria a blank check. If there's a war, Germany is ready and eager to fight.
Many members of the German elite indeed assumed that the crisis could still be contained. And even if it could not be contained, then they were convinced that this was the right moment to strike out.
There's some archival evidence to show that the German elite themselves, the very highest people in government, in collusion with the German army, were indeed preparing for some kind of war sometime in the middle of 1914.
Austria makes a calculation. If the war can be confined to the Balkans, the numbers are on their side. Serbia, they estimate, can field an army of 250,000 men. But Austria-Hungary has an imperial standing army of 500,000 men, twice as big. And what's more, it has the promised backing of the Kaiser's giant standing army of over 800,000 men. In short, the Habsburgs enjoy overwhelming numerical superiority. So on the 23rd of July, they confidently deliver an ultimatum to the Serbian government, demanding that Austrian officials be allowed to enter Serbia to investigate the assassination.
The ultimatum was designed to be completely unacceptable to the Serbs, and indeed it was.
In response, the Serbian Prime Minister appeals to Russia for help. The Russians are fellow Slavs, but more than that, the Tsar is eager to extend his imperial sphere of influence over the Balkans at the expense of Austria-Hungary. Within 48 hours, the Russian Tsar promises to go to any lengths to defend Serbia, adding over 1 million men to the Serbian side.
Russia felt that Germany and Austria were in danger of dominating a region on which
this is why I
Russian
like
commerce would depend in the future.
Documentaries.
Encouraged by the Tsar's support, Serbia rejects the Habsburg ultimatum on the 25th of July. Now, things escalate. The Russian Empire looks for support from her ally, Imperial France. France has been Germany's enemy since 1871, when the German Empire managed to take control of Alsace and Lorraine. This is France's chance to get them back. So France promises to back Russia with her 850,000-strong regular army. As Europe edges towards war, one country attempts to hold back. Britain is the world's greatest trading nation, and war is ruinous for trade.
The initial British cabinet response to any idea of intervention in this continental conflict is one of anathema. They don't want to be involved in this continental war. They've got problems in Ireland. They've had a spate of industrial disputes, which, although over, have still left people concerned about Britain's domestic situation. Has an imperial commerce to protect, and war is bad for business as far as the British government are concerned.
On the 26th of July, Britain calls for a peace conference.
The problem is that no one in Europe is really listening anymore.
To counter the threat from Russia, the Habsburgs call up vast numbers of reservists, swelling their armies to over 3 million men. But the Tsar does the same. Russia's army now expands by an incredible 5 million men. Still, Austria refuses to back down. On the morning of the 28th of July, 1914, Emperor Franz Joseph declares war on Serbia. Instead of holding back, the politicians and generals are rushing headlong towards disaster. In 1914, Europe's imperial powers are summoning vast armies into existence. But how will they move them and supply them? Millions of trained reservists are about to be called up.
Okay.
10 million men are already armed. The horrific scale of World War I, the vast numbers of men killed, none of it would have been possible but for that marvel and symbol of the industrial age, the railway.
Railways were absolutely essential. It was only through railways and steam power that these vast armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers could be brought to the frontiers, supplied, and then carried into battle if necessary.
Russia's mobilization relies on her vast rail network. Over 70,000 kilometers of track. Railways are just as important for Germany, with 63,000 kilometers. Austria-Hungary, France and Britain also have large networks, enabling the war to be fought on a colossal scale.
You could move a lot more men, a lot faster. You could anticipate where they would be at what particular time. You could also move equipment, especially artillery, via rail.
Countless Russian trains are rattling towards the German border, carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
What? Oh,
Just at
okay,
that moment,
I see.
Tsar Nicholas receives a telegram from his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. Wilhelm promises to stay neutral if Russia will stay out of the fight. The telegram causes the Tsar to hesitate. War, it seems, might be averted.
The royal families of Europe were incredibly close. Tsar Nicholas of Russia, King George of Britain, and Kaiser Wilhelm were all first cousins. They called each other Willie, Georgie, and Nicky. They were that close.
On the 29th of July, the Tsar refuses to order full mobilization. He wants to stop the trainloads of soldiers heading towards Germany. He is pulling back from the brink of war. But the troops are already on the move. Millions of men are already gathered at train stations. Hundreds of thousands have already set off. The trains cannot simply stop or reverse.
Everything was planned out even to the minute, which is why things went wrong.
On the 30th of July, the Tsar accepts it's too late to recall his troops. Germany now feels compelled to respond. On the 1st of August, Germany calls up its reservists, another 3.5 million men. The German and Austrian armies now number 7.5 million. But France also calls up its 3 million reserves. The Allied forces number over 10 million. Never in human history have such gigantic armies been marshaled against one another. Austria-Hungary and Germany are outnumbered. To make matters worse for Germany, she faces enemies on two fronts. Russia in the east, France in the west. Britain and Italy are yet to take sides. But numbers will count for less if Germany strikes before her enemies are ready. The Prussian military elite, which is already ready for war, has a plan to win a speedy and stunning victory.
The German calculation was that they could indeed beat France in a rapid war.
They had undertaken a similar operation against the French in 1870-71, a surprise invasion that had encircled and destroyed the French army. They had some confidence that they could do it again.
The plan was drawn up 10 years before by the Prussian nobleman Count Schlieffen, head of the Imperial General Staff. Don't attack the heavily defended French border head-on, but send 5 German armies circling through Belgium. The French army will be focused on the old battlegrounds of Alsace-Lorraine, while huge numbers of Germans pour down into France from the north.
Schlieffen's plan was the most ambitious offensive plan ever devised. It was intended to knock France out of the war in just 6 weeks and allow Germany to transfer almost the entirety of its army to the Eastern Front and deal with Russia in turn.
After quickly defeating France, Germany's armies will be sent east to help the Austrians deal with the Russians. The Schlieffen plan is the first strategic blunder of the Great War. Many more will follow.
The Schlieffen Plan was a big gamble, and as one historian has said, basically made no sense.
The plan assumes that the French are too few, too feeble, and badly led.
Ever since the turn of the century, a negative perception of France's capabilities crept into the mindset of German generals and officers. They noticed the demographic decline that France underwent at the time, and they reckoned that France would not be capable of mustering a strong army.
The Germans decided that the numbers favored them.
Okay, there.
5 armies of more than 1 million men will hit a flank expected to muster little more than half that number of Frenchmen. And if the numbers don't prove overwhelming, the military superiority of Germany's Prussian-dominated army is expected to tip the balance.
In terms of organisation and equipment, the German army was undoubtedly the greatest army in Europe in 1914. It was heavily armed, it was well organised, it was well trained, and it was well prepared.
Ready to put the Kaiser's orders into action are the army's 73,000-strong officer corps.
German army's officer class was in some ways similar to that of Great Britain. It was fiercely aristocratic, it was proud of its aristocratic traditions, and yet it incorporated an enormous strand of professionalism based on the most demanding officer training of any army in Europe.
Below them, 108,000 professional sergeants and corporals, and over 4 million enlisted men.
Bill Belial. I'll do that first.
At the beginning of August, Britain is yet to join the war. Newspapers oppose going to war over Serbia. But Britain might go to war to protect Belgium and France. Blinded by its ambition, the German High Command dismisses the risks of invading Belgium. It doesn't take the threat of British military intervention seriously. Britain historically has had an aversion to large standing armies, a burden on the taxpayer and a threat to freedom. In 1914, despite the size of its empire, Britain can only muster 160,000 men. It's called the British Expeditionary Force, and by comparison to the might of the German army, it is tiny.
Well, it's alleged that the Germans regarded the British as having a contemptible little army that was so small that, as von Bismarck once said, that if it turned up on the Channel coast, they'd send a policeman to arrest it.
For the Schlieffen Plan to work, the vast German armies must move at lightning speed. To do this, the German generals will use industrial methods of mass transport. In 20 days, over 20,000 German trains carry 2 million men, 118,000 horses, and 400,000 tons of supplies to the front.
Well, that is astonishing when you bear in mind they're moving them by steam train, they're moving them hundreds of miles, and the number you're moving is equivalent to the population of Berlin.
It's an extraordinary undertaking. 550 trains a day assemble 7 armies. It takes Germany little more than 1 week to mobilize. It takes France 2 weeks to gather its armies. Austria-Hungary 4 weeks. Russia is expected to take 6 weeks.
Wait, I'm doing 30,000 damage?
On the 4th of August 1914, Germany invades Belgium, a neutral country. Britain now feels compelled to declare war on Germany. Now Britain's transport system swings behind the war effort. In the first few days, 334 trains will move 69,000 men, 21,000 horses along with guns and supplies to Southampton to embark for France. At the same time, 1,000 lorries and 300 buses are requisitioned to carry the British soldiers from the French ports to the front. Many more will march on foot with their kit on their backs.
When he went to France, the soldier of the British Expeditionary Force was wearing this, a set of 1908 pattern equipments. What we've got is a small pack, mess tins on the outside here, personal kit in the ground sheet in here. 2 pints of water in the water bottle, and on this side we've actually got the bayonet and the handle to the entrenching tool. The head to the entrenching tool is here. And around the front we've got pouches on each side. What we've got there, 5 rounds from that pouch. Each one of those pouches, 10 of them altogether, takes 15. It means there's 150 bullets easily available for any soldier in the BEF. This equipment here weighs something like 57 pounds minimum. And in 1914, the minimum weight of a soldier was 112 pounds. With this on at 57 pounds, it's actually more than half his body weight. Going into battle in 1916 with gas masks, steel helmet, grenades, it's probably about 66 pounds.
By late August, just 84,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, have landed in France.
The British Army was a very small body. It was essentially a colonial police force that would be sent to police the Empire, protect it from external threats, and put down internal rebellions. It was not intended for a major war.
Incredibly, the British Army in Europe is smaller even than the 117,000-strong Belgian army.
When thrown into a maelstrom of a massive European conflict, it was undergunned and undersupplied.
And it's about to face the might of the best equipped and best prepared army in the world. The 600,000 German soldiers marching into Belgium. August 1914. Europe's old imperial elite is at war. A new kind of war, which they do not understand and which will lead to their ruin. 600,000 German troops under General Helmut von Moltke are tearing through neutral Belgium. The Germans need to get to France before the French forces have a chance to organize themselves. The trouble is, Belgium is defended by a ring of defensive forts, and it's holding them up.
Belgium's forts put up an unexpectedly strong resistance and massively slowed the German advance. Von Moltke now has no choice but to bring up the heavy guns.
The Germans now unveil the first industrial superweapon of World War I. Nicknamed Big Bertha, this 42-centimetre caliber howitzer gun fires an 800-kilogram shell almost 10 kilometres, well beyond the range of the Belgian artillery. In a matter of hours, the Germans have destroyed Belgium's great forts.
In just one single day, the German artillery overturned 3 centuries of military doctrine that relies on defensive forts. This is a totally new type of war.
But the defiance of ordinary Belgians leads to brutal German reprisals. 6,500 civilians are killed. Thousands more are taken hostage. Almost 1.5 million flee their homes.
Why am I doing that? I could just...
The historic university town of Louvain is looted and set on fire.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Portrayed in the press as the rape of Belgium.
Okay, I am back.
Belgium, it provokes outrage in Britain and America.
There was a massive propaganda campaign that ran in the newspapers following what was referred to as the rape of Belgium. Anything that the Germans did was magnified tremendously. So you started out with a report that the Germans had rung the Antwerp church bells after capturing the city, and by the time the press had done with it, they had hung priests upside down from the church bells and used them as human clappers.
Prussian military brutality
what?
is not new. What is new are the means of mass communication by which news of it quickly spreads.
It was an enormous propaganda own goal for Germany, and one that Britain would never allow it to forget.
Thousands of outraged British people answer the call for volunteers. 33,000 enlist on just one day in September. By the end of that month, the number of volunteers has reached a colossal 760,000. It will be months before Britain's new volunteer army is trained and ready. But they, like the Germans and French, will be trained and equipped for a form of war which no longer exists, though they don't yet know it.
On the outbreak of war, British soldiers were wearing something like this. It's basically a cap, stiffened with a piece of wire, has absolutely no ballistic quality whatsoever. Bullet, shrapnel goes straight through it. German army, slightly better off. They've got this, the Pickelhaube, with a cover over it when it was in use. It might stop a shrapnel ball at long range, might actually turn a blow with a musket butt or something, but that was all. Something better was needed, particularly because the men were in trenches and it was their heads that was the most vulnerable in a trench. So by September 1915, British Army start to get this, called the Brodie after its inventor. Basically, manganese steel designed to deflect bits of shrapnel, fragments of shell, debris falling out the sky. Sadly, by the way, a bullet will go straight through it.
Having overtaken Belgium, a tide of German soldiers move into northern France, slaughtering the British and French in terrifying numbers. The French suffer 140,000 casualties in just 4 days, caused in part by outdated French methods of fighting.
The French were wedded to a tactical doctrine known as the offensive at all costs. This was a doctrine that argued that the best way to defeat the Germans was to attack them in large numbers with the spirit of France, the fury Français. Unfortunately, this resulted in them advancing into artillery, rifle and machine gun fire and dying in catastrophic numbers.
French losses in August of 1914 were absolutely horrendous. They lost 27,000 men, for example, in one single day. And if the losses were to continue at that rate, then every man in France would be dead by 1917.
For the next 2 weeks, the British and French are forced on the run to avoid being encircled by the rapidly advancing German armies.
The retreat was harrowing for all involved. They travelled huge distances on foot. Men had to be dragged along, picked up on supply wagons. Units became mixed. They were outrunning their lines of communication, so they were struggling to feed people.
It looks like the Germans will succeed. France will fall, and the war will be over by Christmas. But just as railways allowed the Germans to strike France with industrial speed and efficiency, they now do the same in the east as Russia attacks Germany. On the 15th of August 1914, 2 Russian armies of 485,000 men invade eastern Germany.
The initial German response to a Russian invasion of East Prussia was actually to fall back away from it, to try and delay the Russian invasion for as long as possible without fighting a major battle.
Russian trains bring their armies to the German border at great speed, but now they hit a glitch. Russian railways use a different gauge track to Germany, so the invading troops have to disembark at the border and advance on foot. Without trains to bring up supplies, the advancing Russian armies pillaged the countryside, rounding up and killing over 1,000 German civilians. The trauma of the Russian invasion will haunt Germany for decades.
A massive displacement of people caused by the Russian invasion then really leads to absolute terror. I mean, it's possible at one point that Berlin might fall. And it's very arguable, actually, Hitler's view towards Russia are shaped very much by those events of early 1914 and the beginning of the war.
In the east, Germany is massively outnumbered. 173,000 German soldiers face 485,000 Russians, advancing in 2 columns. But the Russian army is greatly inferior.
It was a large, slow-moving army, reliant on an antiquated supply network, and above all else, it was being commanded by 2 quarrelling generals. Samsonov and Rennenkampf hated one another and were not on speaking terms, and Russian communications were antiquated, reliant almost entirely on horseborne messenger or radio traffic broadcast without any encryption whatsoever.
The Germans learn from intercepted radio transmissions that the 2 Russian armies have become separated.
They're transmitting radio broadcasts en clair in uncoded messaging which the Germans can anticipate.
The Germans managed to corner 230,000 Russian troops in the south and move in for the kill.
The Russians are now in danger of being cut off. They try to withdraw at the last minute, but it's too late. And the entire Russian offensive at that point is broken. Germany has managed to save itself.
The numbers, again, are shocking. 78,000 Russians are killed or wounded, 92,000 captured. The German casualties are less than 1/10 of that.
Never again in the First World War would an
Damn.
army be encircled and destroyed quite as comprehensively as the Russians were at Tannenberg.
The Russians humiliated in the east, British and French forces decimated in the west, the Germans moving on Paris. The war, it seems, will soon be over. But now it's the turn of the French to deploy their railway network as a weapon of war. Commander Joseph Joffre orders trains to bring men from all over France. They deliver 150,000 Frenchmen, a new army assembled by the River Marne just outside Paris. And the Germans don't even know it's there. The so-called Miracle of the Marne begins on the 5th of September, 1914.
This was the moment when Joffre threw his great counterattack at the Battle of the Marne into action. It was the moment when the war began to turn against the Germans.
When the French need even more troops, they hire 630 Parisian taxis to carry 5,000 reinforcements from Paris to the front. The taxi drivers are even allowed to keep their meters running, and the French government pays the 70,000 franc fare. The French determination to drive the Germans back from Paris is captured in one general's message in the heat of battle. My centre is giving way. My right is in retreat. Situation excellent. I attack.
It's known as the Miracle on the Marne because it seems so unlikely that British and French forces were able to stop this German juggernaut or indeed compel it to withdraw.
But the French attack, supported by the British, stuns the Germans.
The French counterattack was especially effective because of timing. The Germans had overreached themselves. The army had been fighting and marching for weeks, and it was exhausted, and it was struck at a time when it was at its very lowest ebb.
The casualties on both sides are horrific. The Germans lose 105,000 men. The French and British, 85,000. More men are killed and injured in this one single battle than were fielded at Waterloo. Neither side can afford such heavy losses. The Germans withdraw to the north. The Allies are forced to follow. The battered remnants of the British Expeditionary Force finds itself taking up defensive positions around the Belgian town of Ypres. Soon they will find themselves facing an overwhelming force of German soldiers. But this time they are ready. This time they are dug in. What happens at Ypres will go down in history, a tragedy the like of which has never been seen, and it will set the pattern for this senseless, bloody, industrial war. A war of numbers. Men, ammunition, guns, ships, aircraft. Quantity is the difference between victory and defeat. And for the first time in history, everything is recorded in exacting detail. 1 billion artillery shells, 1 million machine guns, 50 billion bullets, 65 million men at war who die at a rate of 6,000 a day. A war of numbers, fought by calculating generals for whom no cost is too high. In the decades leading up to the First World War, Europe has been transformed. A world of peasant farmers, craft workshops, and horse-drawn carts has turned into a world of factories, mills, and railways. Industrialization has revolutionized production and changed society. And it's now about to transform the nature of war. October 1914. Within just weeks of war commencing, the shocking nature of industrial warfare will become clear. The Germans are trying to outflank the French and the British. The Allies need to stop them. The two sides confront each other in the Belgian region of Flanders, at the strategically important town of Ypres. This is to be one of the most famous battles in the history of warfare.
The Battle of Ypres was vital because it represented Germany's last gasp effort to try and win the war in the West before the end of 1914.
Holding Ypres means just as much to the British.
The reason that the fighting for the British seems to focus particularly around the town of Ypres is because it's the nodal point of highways that lead to the Channel ports. If the British can hold this northern nodal town, they are in a position to bring in reinforcements in the future to continue to support their Belgian allies and indeed their French partners.
At the First Battle of Ypres, the weapon that causes most heartache in Germany is the rifle, which had been used in war for more than half a century. But by 1914, British engineers have improved the design. As several thousand German student volunteers advance towards the British lines, they are met with a devastating hail of bullets. Every British infantryman has been issued with a Lee Enfield SMLE Mark III rifle. 4 million of them will soon be in the hands of British soldiers.
This is the short magazine Lee Enfield. The short refers to the length of the barrel, not the size of the magazine. It's adopted by the British Army in 1908, and on the outbreak of war, the soldiers of the BEF go off to war with this weapon. It operates in a very simple system. We take off the safety catch, we open up the bolts, and we take 5 bullets. The Army called them rounds. We push them in the charger bridge and load them into the magazine. We then do the same again, another 5. That now gives me 10 rounds loaded into the magazine. The German Mauser rifle only takes 5 rounds, so a soldier armed with this can fire far more frequently and more effectively than his German opponents. 15 rounds a minute is regarded as minimum, The highest number of rounds recorded by one soldier is 37 in 1 minute, including 22 bullseyes at 300 yards. It's deadly. With this weapon, you can do a lot of damage at even a range of 2,000 yards with not many soldiers because they can fire so frequently.
At Ypres, the Germans experienced the shocking nature of industrial war. Young, wide-eyed students are the victims.
The result was pretty much inevitable. German flesh and blood being thrown against British lines, thinly held though they were. The result was that large numbers of German students and young soldiers were killed, such that even today it's still known as the Kindermord, the massacre of the innocents.
3,000 of Germany's brightest young men now lie in the German student cemetery at Langemarck. But the body count does not deter the German generals. They simply send more and more men towards the British lines. Between October the 19th and November the 22nd, the German army sacrifices 80,000 men. The British army holds its ground, but its losses too are shocking. 54,000 casualties. Of the men who leave Britain to fight at the outbreak of war, within a matter of weeks, more than a third are lost.
You could argue that the BEF had pretty much ceased to exist by the end of November 1914.
Both sides are exhausted, but the battle is a stalemate, and the slaughter is only the beginning. Each army needs shelter from the other's weapons, so they decide to dig trenches, ever more of them, stretching ever further, for thousands upon thousands of miles.
Warfare's changed radically. Now we have rifles and machine guns that can engage at 1,000 yards or more. Artillery can rain down shrapnel and high explosive. Infantry simply cannot survive in the open. The only way it can protect itself is to dig in.
By war's end, the trench labyrinth on the Western Front totals an astonishing 25,000 miles. Enough to encircle the planet. February 1915. After months of killing at Ypres, the British decide to connect their smaller, isolated trenches into a long line. When soldiers dig into the wet, cold mud, the full scale of the slaughter becomes apparent.
It was impossible to dig more than a foot without uncovering a dead body from the earlier battle.
Trenches are a response to firepower. The only way to stay alive on the battlefield is to get into the ground itself. All of this material comes into use. We get sandbags, never full of sand, here actually full of chalk. And then the arrival of these things, called trench mats, sometimes called duck boards. These things get your feet out of the mud, and here, using inverted A-frames, we're actually able to have water running underneath if it's raining heavily. Both sides, we've got corrugated iron.
But in the Flanders winter, the duckboard flooring and the corrugated iron walls are too feeble to keep the elements at bay. For British soldiers, it's a living nightmare.
There's a famous quote from one British observer that says, "You imagine hell to be fire, but it isn't. Hell is mud."
British trenches were in a terrible state. There were insufficient trench stores, such as wooden planks and sandbags to make them habitable, and they were continuously flooded in the wet weather. As the rains fell, bodies floated in the water, which was often knee-deep on the soldiers and sometimes even waist-deep. The flooded state of British trenches were a nightmare for the soldiers' health, who were suffering from trench foot, hypothermia, bronchitis, and much more besides.
Disease and infection is so devastating, it accounts for 1/3 of military deaths. That's over 3 million people.
You have the cold, you have the mud, you have rats everywhere. One of the things that a lot of troops wrote about was the lice. infested with lice. In fact, getting rid of your lice became almost a full-time job unto itself.
German trench systems are far better built and maintained than the British.
They had deeply dug concrete bunkers, very well organized.
The Germans were digging in for the long haul, whereas the British and French expected to use their trenches as jumping off points for an offensive. The Germans were preparing to stay there for years if necessary.
The Germans are right. New weapons pitted against vast armies hiding in their trenches will cause a bloody stalemate and casualties on a scale never seen before. Just a few months into the war, there are trench systems stretching almost 500 miles from the Channel coast to the Swiss border. There are frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, and linking them all, communications trenches. And spread across the killing fields above, a new terrifying weapon of war: barbed wire.
Barbed wire is an agricultural invention of the late 1800s. But the American Army had weaponized it during the Spanish-American War of the late 1890s, and the British Army had used it in a similar fashion during the Boer War in South Africa.
Barbed wire is invented in the mid-19th century as a cheap way to control cattle. Now it will be used to control and kill humans. Attacking soldiers avoiding the barbed wire are funneled towards machine guns, like cattle to the slaughter. Those who try to clamber over the barbed wire are snagged, easy prey for riflemen. Barbed wire is so terrifyingly efficient that over the course of the war, 3 million miles of it is produced, enough to wrap around the planet 120 times. Barbed wire and trenches are the physical symbols of the stalemate reached at the start of 1915. In an effort to break that stalemate, the British Army turns to another recent invention. It's 12 years since the Wright brothers stunned the world with the first powered flight. It doesn't take long for the generals to see the potential use of aircraft in war. Commander of Royal Flying Corps First Wing is Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Trenchard.
Trenchard has many ideas about how the Royal Flying Corps could contribute to the coming offensive, but the one which Haig seizes upon is the use of aircraft to carry out reconnaissance flights over German lines. The tool of reconnaissance for the RFC is the camera.
In January 1915, the RFC is supplied with A cameras, designed to take aerial photographs of German lines and their hidden artillery batteries. The planes will be put to devastating use against the Germans at the French town of Neuve-Chapelle. This will be a military assault of a new kind. Britain's Royal Flying Corps will send its planes over German positions to photograph them.
This was the first time that the British Army had aerial reconnaissance carried out on a large scale, and the Royal Flying Corps did its work remarkably well.
In previous wars and battles, reconnaissance had mainly been carried out by the cavalry. But in the First World War, where you had this line of trenches, it was very difficult for anyone, let alone the cavalry, to get beyond the enemy lines. But what was new was the aeroplane. You could send airplanes up to a considerable height, and the observers inside could either sketch what was underneath or could take photographs. And these photographs could then be placed together to create a mosaic map of the enemy lines.
To carry out an effective bombardment that hits all aspects of the enemy's defensive system, you need more than just men on the ground with binoculars. You need to take to the skies. You need aerial observation.
This novel use of planes gives the British a huge tactical advantage. From now on, for all sides, aerial reconnaissance would be indispensable. The number of RFC aerial reconnaissance photographs printed in 1915 total 80,000. By 1918, the cameras they use have been improved, and there are thousands more aircraft to fly them above enemy lines. As a result, the number of pictures they take increases massively to almost 6 million. The British have proved how important planes are, and yet, at the start of the war, they find they have far too few of them. In 1914, the British only have 193 planes. The French have 541. Austria have 64. The Germans have more planes than any other combatant, with 694. But it's a testament to the strength of British manufacturing at the time that they are quickly able to turn the tables.
The manufacturing infrastructure required to build so many planes is absolutely enormous. You just have to look between 1914 and 1918, the number of French aircraft workers rose from 12,500 to 185,000. And by the end of the war, Britain's aircraft industry is easily the largest in the world and employs 347,000 workers.
Over the course of the war, the Allies make 120,000 aircraft, outproducing Germany by practically 2/3. But in August 1915, the use of the airplane takes a new, even more deadly turn.
The Dutch engineer Anthony Fokker developed a mechanism that would allow to fire a machine gun through the rotating propeller of a plane, and that gave the nascent German Air Force round about 8 months of superiority.
Anthony Fokker's interrupter gear links the firing mechanism of a mounted machine gun with the crankshaft of an aircraft's propeller. This allows German pilots to fire through a propeller without destroying its blades. Fokker's invention turns the agile and speedy German Eindecker into the world's first fighter aircraft. Royal Flying Corps reconnaissance planes now find themselves under fire from German fighter pilots, and are soon being shot out of the sky at an alarming rate of 60 per month. This revolution in aerial warfare becomes known as the Fokker Scourge.
The Fokker Scourge is significant for battles being fought on the ground because the infantry and the artillery are now heavily reliant on what aeroplanes can do for them.
The average life expectancy of British Army pilots becomes just 11 days. The Royal Flying Corps gets a nickname: the Suicide Club. But its reconnaissance missions are claiming even more German lives on the ground. Aerial photographs taken over Neuve-Chapelle are being used to devastating effect by the British. Never before has an artillery attack been so well targeted and so terrifyingly effective. 342 British guns fire thousands of shells with deadly accuracy. What's more, for weight of shells fired per yard of enemy front, it is the heaviest bombardment of the war so far. The artillery blasts a hole in the German lines, which is quickly filled by 60,000 men of the British First Army. Victory should be theirs. But now, things go wrong for the British.
Although the ground beyond the German front line is there for the taking, the infantry have to wait.
British artillery is still shelling the empty area in front of the troops.
German forces were in complete disarray long before the artillery barrage ended.
The British have yet to master another modern weapon of war, which is being used for the first time: telecommunications.
German shells cut telephone lines, interference blocked wireless transmissions, and messengers carrying precious orders and reports disappeared into the smoke of battle and were never seen again.
In this brutal war, the art of communication has not kept pace with the art of killing. British and Indian soldiers will pay with their lives. March 1915. At Neuve-Chapelle, in a fatal lack of communication, the British infantry advance has been blocked by its own artillery shelling. The delay highlights the growing importance of a powerful new instrument of war. The telephone was patented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. It was used first by post offices, railway stations, stock exchanges, and wealthy individuals. Now it will be used by generals to communicate with their frontline troops.
What I've got here is the D3 phone, the standard phone of early in the war. We've got here a watch set which allows me to put this on my ear and have it on my head so I can listen in case a message comes in. I've then got the standard telephone handset which I can flip open and use in the normal way. But next to the batteries, I've then got a Morse code set, which means that if my other station is fairly close, we use this. If the signal's weak, we put it away and we use Morse code and we listen into the message and note it down. The problem is, to make this work, you have to have telephone cables. And if you go too far forward or the enemy shelling cuts the telephone cable, this thing is utterly useless. And at Neuve-Chapelle, as the infantry advance, communications break down, the gunners don't know where the infantry are, the infantry can't get the gunners' support, the battle really grinds to a halt because of the limitations of this new telephone system.
At Neuve-Chapelle, British telephone communication is still down.
And that pause gave the Germans enough time to reorganize their defenses.
By the time the British gunners are finally ordered to cease fire, the Germans are plugging the hole in their line with 90 infantrymen of the 11th Jaeger Battalion. Advancing towards them are 9,000 men of the British First Army. Although outnumbered 100 to 1, the Jaegers have one overriding advantage. They have brought with them a new kind of mechanized weapon, which will slaughter humans at a speed and on a scale that will shock the world.
They brought with them machine guns, and machine guns are a great leveler in the First World War.
Machine guns truly changed the mathematics of warfare, the reality of warfare. A Lee Enfield rifle, for example, British troops were trained to fire 15 rounds a minute, which was pretty quick. But machine guns could fire something like 600 rounds a minute. That's 40 times as many bullets.
The story of the machine gun dates back to 1862, when American inventor Dr. Richard Gatling patents the Gatling gun. Gatling hopes that the weapon's extraordinary power to kill will discourage war and save lives. He is wrong. In the 1880s, American inventor Hiram Stevens Maxim improves the design. His gun fires an extraordinary 11 bullets a second. In the battlefield conditions of World War I, machine guns are spewing out more than 600 rounds every single minute. One machine gunner has the firepower of 40 riflemen. At the Battle of the Somme, just 10 British machine guns were fired for 12 hours, sending out 1 million rounds. Between 1914 and 18, 1.1 million are made in the factories of the great powers. By the start of 1915, Germany's arsenal of MG-08 machine guns numbers 10,000. At Neuve-Chapelle, the 90 infantrymen have just 2 machine guns against 9,000 British attackers. But it's enough.
The small unit are able to use just 2 Maxim machine guns, and that's sufficient to lay down a belt of fire of something like 24,000 rounds every 15 minutes. Crossing that open ground against that weight of fire means that the advantage is then conferred back on the defenders.
In the space of 90 minutes, they were able to inflict more than 1,000 casualties on the attacking British infantry.
In the end, the only thing that stops the Jaegers is the resumption of the British artillery barrage. By the end of the battle, 21,000 men have been killed or wounded. And all that's happened is the German line has moved by about a mile. The pattern of the war on the Western Front is set. Its entrenched stalemate. A war of bloody attrition. Generals order massive artillery bombardments to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible, and then send thousands of their own men over the top to be cut down in often calamitous infantry advances. To fight such a war, British generals will demand an endless supply of men, bullets, and artillery shells. At the beginning of 1915, Britain is producing 7,000 big shells a day, which sounds an awful lot, but it is nowhere near enough. The British arrive at Neuve-Chapelle with over 200,000 shells, which has taken British factories a month to produce. But the shells are spent in just 4 days.
By the end of the Great War, over 1 billion shells have been fired by all sides. That is an absolutely extraordinary number.
The shell industry simply was not set up to produce the ammunition required by these guns.
On the 14th of May, a headline in the Evening Telegraph proclaims, "Scarcity of shells hinders British attacks." The scandal topples Asquith's Liberal government.
The shell crisis gave the Conservatives an opportunity to force upon him the much-desired coalition government that they had been agitating for since August 1914.
So serious is the shell crisis that most British guns are reduced to firing just 4 times a day. But with enough shells, they could fire 300 times a day. To deal with the crisis, the government does something previously unthinkable.
The British government is going to have to structurally change its relationship to industry in a method that's going to be termed war communism, a level of involvement of government in production unimaginable before the war.
With large parts of industry now under state control, the government prioritizes the production of shells. It faces 2 challenges. First, a shortage of manpower, and second, a shortage of a volatile liquid called acetone. It solves the first by recruiting a new industrial army, around 1 million strong, consisting mostly of women. The second is solved by a Manchester chemist called Chaim Weizmann, who invents a fermentation method to turn grain into acetone. To do this, the government commandeers brewing and distillery equipment and sets up 2 new factories which will produce 90,000 gallons of acetone a year. As a result, by the end of 1915, British shell production rises to a whopping 16.4 million. And by 1917, the British Empire is supplying more than 50 million shells a year. But in this new industrial war, Britain and Germany are too evenly matched. To break the stalemate, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill has an idea. Why not pit Britain's new industrial army against the primitive forces of the Ottoman Empire? If Britain captures Gallipoli and the Bosphorus, it will open a sea route to Russia.
The Allies try and open up a second front because their front in the west has become bogged down in the stalemate of trench warfare. They see this as a way of unblocking the war, achieving a link-up with the Russians, and winning a war in the east if the war in the west isn't working. They're able then to send an amphibious force to invade Gallipoli. But then when they do that, they discover that the Ottoman forces, equipped with modern German weapons, are able to use these very effectively, using the high ground to turn the landing beaches into a killing zone, and then to simply engage them in the same sort of trench warfare as they had in the West. It becomes another stalemate. It bogs down, no one's going anywhere.
Unfortunately for Britain's imperial forces, the Ottomans had been supplied with advanced German machine guns. Allied soldiers are mercilessly cut down. Total casualties from the Gallipoli campaign reach a staggering 400,000, many of them from Britain's colonies. Conflict on the ground and in the air is being transformed by technology and mass production. And in 1915, they combine again to bring new and previously unimaginable levels of violence to war at sea.
The lines of what is right and wrong are absolutely blurred, and this kind of warfare is a descent into inhumanity that the world hasn't seen before.
But in this new war of numbers, there is one area in which Britain has a clear lead. The British Royal Navy is the world's biggest, with more ships than the German Imperial Fleet. Britain rules the waves, and now sets out to cut off supplies to Germany. The hunger blockade will starve the German people of food and German industry of raw materials.
The naval blockade was a really controversial strategy, and the Germans protested that actually this wasn't hitting troops, this was hitting innocent civilians back on the home front.
The German government puts its people on starvation rations of just 1,000 calories a day. Soon, Germans are suffering from malnutrition and associated diseases, scurvy, tuberculosis and dysentery.
The Germans suffered an enormous shortage of not only raw materials, but fertiliser and foodstuffs such as grain, cereals, meat, potatoes. And this causes incredible disquiet and unrest throughout Germany and even in Austria.
By war's end, deaths linked to malnutrition total almost 900,000. The USA is also unhappy with the blockade. For America's giant farms, industrial Germany is one of their biggest markets.
At this point in the war, they're still trading with Germany, and this naval blockade means that none of their merchant ships can get through, they're not earning any foreign currency, and so of course it's bad for the American economy as well.
To break the blockade, Germany turns to another innovative weapon, a weapon that will change the nature of naval warfare. They call it the Unterseeboot, or undersea boat. It will become famous across the world as the U-boat. Germany is desperate to end the Royal Navy's sea blockade, starving its people of food and its industry of raw materials. But its fleet is massively outnumbered, so it turns to a new, terrifying weapon: the submarine. The first military sub used in action was the Turtle. In 1776, the Americans tried to attach bombs to the hulls of British ships. By the First World War, German shipyards are building U-boats with an incredible range of 7,800 miles, armed with 6 torpedoes and a fearsome 88mm deck gun. They are killing machines, but for their crews, life on board is worse than grim.
Conditions in submarines were awful. They were dirty, smelly, cramped, and pretty terrifying.
But what U-boat crews fear most are the odds of survival, which are roughly 50-50. 375 subs set sail from German ports. 202 are lost in action. U-boat crews number 11,400. Almost half will lose their lives. In February 1915, Germany declares the waters around the British Isles a war zone. U-boats are ordered to break so-called prize rules and sink on sight any ship in British waters, even neutrals. This, it turns out, is a bad idea. On May the 7th, U-20 is patrolling 18 kilometers off the coast of Southern Ireland when it spots the Lusitania, an American passenger boat steaming toward Liverpool. Without warning, U-20 carries out her murderous orders.
Well, they attacked it with torpedoes, scoring direct hits right on the central line of the ship itself. The ship sank very, very rapidly.
It's unmitigated carnage.
1,960 passengers and crew are on board. 1,197 perish. 124 of them are American citizens. It's an act of barbarism for which the Germans will pay dearly.
Ever since the reign of Henry VIII, if you wanted to sink an enemy ship, then you stop and you search for contraband, and then you allow people to leave the ship, and then you sink it. So if there was any humanity in naval warfare before then, it's definitely reduced by the onset of the submarine menace.
The loss of innocent lives is a propaganda disaster for the Germans.
Recruitment posters went up all across London and other British cities demanding justice and revenge for the Lusitania. Riots broke out across London and went on for days. Millions of pounds of damage against German shops, German citizens, or even people with German-sounding names.
Worse still is the outrage in America. The USA is not even at war, but Germany is sinking American ships and killing its people. President Woodrow Wilson is pushed closer to joining a war he had hoped to avoid. The Royal Navy's revenge for the attack is brutal. British sub-hunter HMS Baralong is 70 miles northwest of Cornwall, posing as a merchant vessel, when it sneaks up on and sinks U-boat U-27. And the Brits do not play by the rules.
There were a number of German sailors in the water, and instead of taking them prisoner, they shot them in the water. And this caused outrage in Germany, and the Germans called it a war crime.
Though war has always been bloody and brutal, Europe's old ruling classes had thought of it as a kind of game, with codes of conduct and honor. But the horror of industrial war sweeps that away, and the Germans, who think themselves the most civilized people, now turn to what many consider the ugliest and cruelest weapons of war.
The Germans are outnumbered. They're well aware of it. The enemy, the Allies, have more men, they've got more guns, more everything. They cannot win by simply trying to match the enemy. What they can do is reach for new technology. And if that new technology is poison gas that may or may not be legal, they're going to use it. It's their war-winning card.
Gas warfare came as a surprise, and there was no protection available to men in the trenches from it.
Gas is a terrifying weapon that causes awful injuries.
What it made you do is drown on dry land. It would agonizingly damage your lungs so that they filled up with water, and you couldn't breathe. You see photos of victims, and their hands are in clawed positions where they've literally been trying to claw out their own throat.
All the great powers signed the 1899 Hague Convention, prohibiting chemical projectiles. But in this hellish war, conventions count for nothing. Every sector of German industry is dragged into service, and her chemical industry is the biggest of all the other great powers. So large that it accounts for 40% of global chemical exports. Chemist Fritz Haber of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute builds their first chemical weapon using chlorine. On April the 22nd, at the Second Battle of Ypres, 6,000 gas cylinders are brought to the front line.
The Germans really took their gloves off. They opened up these huge cylinders, undid the valves, and out came this greenish-yellow gas and floated towards the French lines.
The sickly fog, smelling slightly of pepper and pineapple, drifts across to the French trenches, enveloping the soldiers. At first, they are unsure what to make of it.
What was really happening here? Was this a smokescreen? And it's only as this thick yellowish fog reaches the Allied lines and the troops begin to suffocate that they realize the true horror of what's happening to them. They flee, many of them suffocate. It's panic.
This single release of gas results in the gruesome death of 800 men. The German generals are delighted, but the chemist Fritz Haber will soon regret his actions.
Fritz Haber's wife Clara was so disturbed by the work that her husband was doing that she actually shot herself with his military weapon because she couldn't stand to think what her husband had done.
Haber, who is Jewish, will later flee Nazi Germany. The poisoned gas Germany subsequently develops will be used to exterminate Haber's own people, Europe's Jews, and other so-called non-humans. But in World War I, Britain quickly follows Germany, and within 6 months has built its own chlorine chemical weapons. These are first used at the Battle of Loos, but for the British, it's a disaster.
The wind did not carry the gas to the Germans, but instead blew it back onto the British defenders. British General Hubert Gough aptly summed this up by commenting that gas was a boomerang ally.
To solve the problem, a captain in the Royal Engineers, William Livens, invents the so-called Livens projector, a mortar that fires gas-filled canisters. Over the course of the war, Livens projectors will fire 200,000 barrels of deadly gas. After chlorine comes phosgene, which also attacks the throat and lungs, but the effects are far worse.
Of all the gases used, by far the biggest killer is phosgene. It accounts for 76,000 of the 90,000 gas deaths.
Gas attacks prompt governments to order over 100 million gas masks. But before they arrive at the front, soldiers must somehow make their own.
The solution was simply using a moistened handkerchief or a sock over the mouth and nose. The best liquid to use actually was urine, but not fresh urine. It had to be stale. That allowed the ammonia to develop, which in some ways neutralized the gas. However, very quickly, the army adopt this thing, which is the hypo helmet. It's a bag which goes over the head, and once it goes over your head, it's already soaked in photography fixative. And what that does is it converts the chlorine gas into common salts. There are problems with it, one of which you've got to tuck it in around your neck. Next problem is you get a build up of carbon dioxide inside it, and if it's raining, then the liquid runs down your face and into your eyes, and people would tear these things off and try and get out of the gas cloud. But early in the war, early in the use of gas, the best thing available, the hypo helmet.
But against chemicals, gas masks don't always work. The next weapon devised in Germany is sulfur mustard, known to the terrified troops as mustard gas. This time, a mask cannot save you.
Mustard gas is a uniquely awful chemical weapon. It burned your skin when it came in contact with it, leaving you with agonising blisters. Those who died from mustard gas often endured a protracted and miserable death. It would take 4 or 5 weeks to finally pass away, and those 4 or 5 weeks would be spent coughing up blood and slowly dying an agonising death.
All the imperial generals in World War I are guilty of ordering the use of poison gas. The British use 14,000 tons, the French 26,000 tons. But the biggest users by far are the Germans, who use 52,000 tons. Poisonous gas is not 1915's only new and terrifying weapon. Another German invention is the Flammenwerfer, or flamethrower. A tank of pressurized gas is used to force flammable oil across an igniting wick and out of a steel nozzle. The result is a 20-meter jet of intense fire and choking black smoke. On the battlefield, flamethrowers are used to drive men out of the trenches, where they can be mown down by machine guns. They are first used against the French in October 1914. The British encounter them during a German night raid on trenches at Hooge, Flanders, on July the 30th, 1915.
The first the British defenders know of their appearance is when the night sky is illuminated by a wave of liquid fire washing over the parapet and rolling through the British trenches, igniting men and materials wherever it touches. The silence of the evening is shattered by the screams of those caught by this dreadful attack.
Not surprisingly, flamethrower operators become prime targets for enemy snipers.
The life expectancy of flamethrower operators is often very short in the First World War. Over the course of the war, Germans make around 650 flamethrower attacks. If they achieve surprise, they are devastatingly effective. But if they're caught in the open, the flamethrower operators often pay a high price in lives.
But neither gas, nor flame, nor artillery shell can break the deadlock in 1915. The new industrial weapons do not secure victory for any of the competing imperial powers. They simply magnify the horrors of war. A war of numbers. Men, ammunition, guns, ships, aircraft. Quantity is the difference between victory and defeat. And for the first time in history, everything is recorded in exacting detail. 1 billion artillery shells, 1 million machine guns, 50 billion bullets, 65 million men at war who die at a rate of 6,000 a day. A war of numbers, fought by calculating generals for whom no cost is too high. The First World War is almost a year and a half old. The scale of death and destruction has already reached shocking levels. But things are about to get worse. Much worse. 1916 is the year of Verdun and the killing fields of the Somme. Millions will die.
In terms of sheer carnage, it is understandable why the year 1916 has been dubbed a descent into hell.
January 1916. Bogged down in the trenches, neither side has achieved a significant breakthrough. Generals decide that the only way they can begin making gains is to overwhelm their enemy with numbers. Vast numbers.
The numbers are staggering.
The scale is going to be carnage almost unimaginable.
The conflict has become a numbers game. In a war started by monarchs and aristocrats, ordinary men have become sacrificial pawns. If one side orders 100,000 men into battle, the other side will send even more. And if that 100,000 is slaughtered, they will simply send in another 100,000 to be cut down.
It was thought to be their role to charge and to die. And over time, they started to count more and more on each other, but trusted less and less the decisions made by generals.
The men marching to war in 1916 are very different to those who were there at the start.
A lot of the old professional soldiers had been killed or wounded, so on both sides, many of the new forces were made up of more recently trained, less experienced men.
We've got a large number of young people who come forward at the start of the war who want to play their part in world history. This is their moment.
Europe's ruling classes use forced conscription to expand their armies. From 1914 to 1916, Germany's doubles to over 6.5 million. The Habsburgs triples to almost 5 million. But Britain, France and their allies still massively outnumber the Germanic powers. Traditionally, Britain has kept a small army of professional soldiers. But after losses of 400,000, they need more men. Unlike other European powers, Britain, at first, relies on volunteers. The government makes an appeal to patriotic pride and encourages men to sign up in groups with their friends and workmates, in so-called PALS battalions.
The idea of forming a PALS battalion is that if the guy that lived next door to you, the guy that worked in a factory with you, the guy that you'd known since school signed up, and you could sign up and you'd all go together, that it would make you more likely to volunteer for war.
The PALS recruitment drive is a resounding success.
1,500 people signed up from Liverpool alone and then spread to over 50 towns across the United Kingdom.
You had the Accrington PALS, you had Salford PALs. PALs battalions weren't necessarily location-based. You had things like the Footballers Battalion as well.
The record set on the busiest day of recruitment numbers 33,000. But by 1916, flag-waving patriotism has given way to the horrifying realization of what war means. And the British government introduces forced conscription. In all, 2.3 million British men will be compelled to fight.
The group that suffered the most in terms of casualties was definitely the working class. They were on the front lines, they were the Tommies going over the top.
1916's descent into hell begins in February at Verdun, a French border town surrounded by 60 large and small forts. German generals choose Verdun for one simple reason. They want to kill as many French soldiers as possible.
There's a huge amount of emotional investment in the town of Verdun for the French people. It represented the frontier zone beyond which lay the territories of Alsace-Lorraine, the two provinces lost to Germany in the War of 1870-71, a stinging humiliation which they were desperate to get revenge for.
The chief of the German General Staff is Erich von Falkenhayn. His plan is to lure the French into defending Verdun until the last man, to defeat the French by killing them.
The conception of the Verdun offensive on the German side, attributed to Falkenhayn, is this concept of Weissbluten, some idea that you could bleed France white by choosing a location in which they would throw their forces in, and you could destroy them with artillery repeatedly, day after day after day.
Germany shifts more weapons to this single battle than any attacking force in military history.
They are bringing in so many guns that it's a concentration that's never been seen before on the Western Front, or indeed, frankly, in warfare.
Germans assembled 1,200 guns and 2.5 million shells prior to Verdun. So great is the artillery concentration that it requires an entirely new railway line constructed in secret to supply it.
1,300 munitions trains bring the bullets and shells for a German fighting force 106,000 strong.
The French were ill prepared for the coming storm at Verdun. They were distracted by their own offensive preparations at the River Somme, and perhaps they put unwarranted faith in the iconic fortress at Verdun being able to withstand any German assault.
"4 a.m., Monday morning, February the 21st, 1916.
It begins with a massive artillery bombardment, the largest in human history up to this point.
"1,200 German guns rain down an incredible 2 million shells on a French defensive line just 8 miles wide.
So great is the weight of bombardment, so deafening, so overwhelming that soldiers are reported as losing their minds, desperate for it to end.
Not only do the French endure the heaviest artillery bombardment ever, they do it without steel helmets. For them, head protection does not arrive for a further 4 months, much later than their British allies. Foundries in Sheffield have been making steel Brodie helmets since 1915.
In 1915, British soldiers on the Western Front received the first of these. This is the Brodie, named after its inventor. This helmet is very simple to make. It's actually stamped cold from a single piece of metal. That means that factories can make them in their tens of thousands. In fact, well over 1 million are made in the first batch. What happens is there's a die, this shape, and it simply punches in, punching it out in one piece. You trim it, paint it, line it, it's ready to go. It's not the best helmet in the war. They won't stop a bullet, but what they will do is deflect shrapnel balls, and they'll deal with falling fragments. This means that although the number of head injuries actually go up because they're feeling braver, The number of fatalities goes down.
At Verdun, when the shelling stops, the troops go in. 80,000 German soldiers advance in the first wave. In places, they outnumber the French by 10 to 1. Within 4 days, the French have fallen back to their third line of defense. The Germans are tracking the retreat from the skies.
The Germans have also assembled the greatest concentration of aircraft yet seen in history, allowing them to dominate the skies above the battlefield.
They actually have 168 aircraft, which gives them the ability to control the air, but more important, they can now direct artillery fire, they can locate French reserves moving in, they can allocate resources where they're needed. Air supremacy has emerged as a key component in modern battles.
5 days in, and the battle appears to be going all Germany's way. Their next objective is a fort, the most important of the 60 forts protecting Verdun, Fort Douaumont. The French think Fort Douaumont is impregnable, so it just has a token force.
Fort Douaumont is considered such a strong position that it only needs, as far as the French are concerned, the equivalent of 2 platoons, about 50-odd men, to hold it.
But the French are wrong.
Once German artillery had flattened a ditch that was surrounding Fort Douaumont and allowed German troops to enter, the operation was fairly simple.
German generals face a dilemma. According to their plan, they should wait for the French to send reinforcements and kill as many as they can. But now they're tempted to press home their advantage and push on into France. Whichever option they choose, one thing is certain. Hundreds of thousands of men will die. At Verdun, Germany has unleashed the most ferocious bombardment in history and taken Fort Douaumont. The German plan had been to wait for the French to send wave after wave of troops who would be mown down. But the German generals now attempt to take Verdun. They call up more men, throwing 500,000 into the battle. It is a bad decision, which will cost 300,000 French and German lives.
The German commanders became greedy. What this resulted in was not the Germans sitting in defensive positions and mowing down French attackers, but instead both armies becoming locked into a seesaw battle for control of ever more devastated forts. The result was a meat grinder of monumental proportions.
German General von Falkenhayn has badly underestimated the determination and spirit of the French.
Once certain positions have been lost, to simply admit defeat would have appeared a betrayal of those that have been killed.
Von Falkenhayn has made a serious mistake. He's underestimated the strength of French resistance.
He also underestimates French military skill. On February the 25th, the master tactician Marshal Philippe Pétain takes charge of the French forces.
The appointment of Marshal Pétain is significant because he approaches this in terms of a ruthless application of what resources are required and the rotation of units, so that he's never exhausting one division or one corps. It's a rotated effort, and this is sufficient to absorb the sheer power of the German offensive.
Every spare French soldier is sent to push the Germans back. Over the entire battle, of 330 French infantry regiments, 259 fight at Verdun. Pétain also persuades his political masters to give him more artillery, turning the tables on the Germans, who take a pounding.
Pétain assembles a truly impressive counter-battery force of French artillery, and in an ironic twist, it is the German infantry that finds itself thrown against French artillery concentrations, suffering horrendous casualties.
By the end of April, the battle has inflicted huge losses on both sides. France has lost 131,000 men, the Germans 120,000.
Von Falkenhayn expects the French to hurl themselves against the Germans and die in large numbers as a result. What he gets instead is a two-way attritional battle where his troops attack as often as they defend, and both Germans and French suffer ruinous casualties together.
Von Falkenhayn had planned the speedy slaughter of the French, but Verdun instead becomes an almost year-long killing zone for both sides. Shells fired number at least 40 million. Casualty figures are unprecedented. On average, both sides lose 1,000 men a day. A staggering 700,000 in all. First one side take the upper hand, then the other.
The battle seesawed over its 10-month duration. Some villages changed hands up to 15 times as they were first captured by the Germans and then liberated by the French.
Just as industrial production has changed war on land, so a new generation of ships will do the same at sea. Another momentous battle is about to begin. It will be fought off the Danish peninsula of Jutland.
The Battle of Jutland is a clash between the most powerful weapon systems in the world. The largest, most heavily armed and most heavily armoured ships in human history to this point are about to engage one another. It's also the only time that British and German dreadnought battleships exchange fire with one another.
Britain's dominance at sea is hurting Germany. A highly effective British naval blockade is starving the German people of food and German industry of raw materials. In early 1916, the German High Seas Fleet is told it's time to smash it.
What can the expensive, much lauded High Seas Fleet do to break this blockade?
Germany's big problem is the Royal Navy.
The Royal Navy is the first line of defence for an island nation. They police the seas. They don't call her the senior service for nothing.
In 1914, the Royal Navy's fleet is almost twice the size of Germany's. At Jutland, the numbers involved are slightly more balanced, but the Royal Navy's force is still a third larger. British warships number 151, Germany's 99. British naval dominance is not new. What is new are the battleships being built in British and German dockyards. The revolution begins when in 1906 the Royal Navy launches HMS Dreadnought, a mighty new killing machine for the industrial age.
HMS Dreadnought was armed with 10 12-inch naval guns, able to fire at ranges of up to 20,000 yards.
And it was quick.
HMS Dreadnought was driven by modern steam turbines, which allowed it to move at an unprecedented speed of up to 21 knots.
Dreadnought lends its name to a new class of heavily armed, very dangerous and very expensive battleship. In today's money, each costs over £300 million to build. At the start of the war, the Germans have 16 compared to Britain's 28. Despite having fewer ships, Germany wants to take on Britain's fleet, but not all at once.
The High Seas Fleet does not want a pitched battle with the entire Royal Navy. What it wants to do is isolate a small portion of the Royal Navy, a squadron perhaps, and destroy it, and then retreat back to its bases before the bulk of the Royal Navy can arrive to extract retribution.
The Germans hope to weaken the Royal Navy by ambushing its 52-strong battlecruiser squadron before the 99 ships of the main fleet can join them. But the Germans are communicating in a code which has been deciphered by the British.
Unbeknownst to the Germans, the Royal Navy had a crucial intelligence advantage.
The British not only managed to capture the German code books, they'd also managed to keep it secret. So the Germans had no idea that the British were reading their signals.
A Royal Navy group of cryptographers known as Room 40 were reading German naval traffic, and they knew of the German manoeuvres before the German fleet had even left harbour.
But when the two fleets come face to face, that intelligence will count for little. What follows is so devastating It will be the last battle of its kind in military history. Northern Germany, May the 31st, 1916, 1 a.m. A scouting group of 40 German ships leave port. They are followed an hour later by 59 ships of the German High Seas Fleet. The British are already at sea. At 2:20 p.m. the German scouts are spotted. West of Jutland, Royal Navy battlecruiser HMS Galatea signals. Enemy in sight.
This is the moment the Royal Navy has been waiting for the entire war.
The British battlecruisers give chase to the scouting ships.
Okay, so I'm actually dozing off. I don't know if I was heard, but I'm dozing off. So thank you to whoever joined for this short stream. Sorry I didn't have any good music going on. I apologize for not having a good music come on. I just felt like watching a documentary, which this is a good one. I like it. But thank you all for joining. I will see you tomorrow and Sunday, possibly. So yeah, take care. Have a good night.